Swords of the Serpentine is a tabletop role-playing game by Kevin Kulp and Emily Dressner, published in 2020 by Pelgrane Press, with the hardbacks released in 2022. If the name Pelgrane Press sounds vaguely familiar to you, it's because they're the ones who publish a lot of RPGs that use the gumshoe system designed by Kenneth Haidt and Robin D. Laws, and this game, Swords of the Serpentine, is one of those. The main thrust of this game is that it's gumshoe, which emphasizes streamlined investigation adventures, but in the sword and sorcery genre. This by itself is not remarkable and in fact raises a huge question of how can you reconcile a Conan-style world into an investigation-oriented rule set? And the solution to that problem involves two things: focusing play on a single huge fantasy city and expanding the concept of a clue to include anything that leads to more adventure generally. But there's also a third element that makes this game actually work, and it's the beefed up combat and dangerous magic. All this stuff works in synergy to drive home a really strong sword and sorcery RPG that really makes the gumshoe system sing. So the theme and motif of this game is sword and sorcery. Think classic fantasy fiction like Conan and like Conan. Actually, there's a long history of sword and sorcery literature that includes not just the works of Conan creator Robert E. Howard, but also Andrzej Sapkowski of The Witcher fame, Fritz Lieber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser series, and Michael Moorcock. The subgenre generally includes weapon-wielding heroes involved in exciting, violent adventures that usually involve the supernatural, but focus on battles and intrigue at the personal level. If you have absolutely no idea where to start in this genre, I'd suggest searching for some of the mini Conan comic books that specifically retell any of Howard's 21 original stories. These tend to portray the core tenets of the sword and sorcery genre in a quick and fun-to-read format. Although, to be honest, the genre has grown and matured over the decades, especially in terms of the sexism. You're not going to see even a hint of the old problems of the sword and sorcery genre in this game. The first thing you'll notice about chapter creation in this game is the suggestions for what kind of group your PCs are. This is the first sign that this game is more than just a straightforward gumshoe investigative RPG, since what brings your PCs together and motivates them can be virtually anything. The actual first step of creating your character is to choose a profession, of which there are just a handful: Sentinel, Sorcerer, Thief, and Warrior. This choice doesn't have a huge mechanical bearing on play, but it's pretty important in defining the backstory and roleplay aspects of your character. Then you come up with some adjectives to describe your PC, and then write down 3 drives. This will give you a +1 on a die roll if you're able to invoke them in a check, and you can change them over time. Okay, so here's where the game and the gumshoe system in general is a bit different from most standard RPG rule sets. Investigative abilities. You can rank in them from 1 to 5, and if you have any rank in them, then you can use them in a scene to gather a lead in an investigation. And they always work. There's no roll to see if you fail. They're actually so potent that they're limited by the number of players at the table. When you build your character, you get anywhere from 10 to 14 points to put into these investigative abilities. This list of abilities are basically the beating heart of the play experience in the game because they are the primary way of moving the story forward. In traditional gumshoe adventuring structure, the GM organizes a flowchart of scenes that get unlocked by key clues, which can only be accessed by the player stating that they want to use one of these abilities. If I had one complaint here with these ability descriptions, it's that they are not broken down into an easy to reference format. They each have a section called Sample Spend, but those examples are given in paragraph format, where a bulleted format would have been much easier to parse out when rereading. By the way, a spend in this case refers to using points from your ability pool to get a stronger result. So for example, if you had a rating of 5 in Liar's Tale, you can spend up to 5 points to heighten this ability in a scene. Your rating of 5 in the ability never changes, but the points get depleted and then replenished over time. There are other uses for these spendable investigative ability points as well. Investigative ability points are always fully refreshed at the start of each adventure, and the GM can refresh those at will for whatever reason, but refreshing general ability points is a bit more frequent. There's a shared pool of refresh tokens, and anyone can redeem those tokens to restore general points 1 for 1. One thing worth noting here is that the game emphasizes player world building, as in the GM is encouraged in some places to invite the players to add to and create details of the world they're in. One example here is with the Laws and Traditions ability. One sample spend is to make up an obscure dictate or city ordinance, and it becomes canon for the entire campaign. The Corruption ability happens to be a very pivotal one in this game because it's the only one that can grant your character the use of magic or sorcery. You need at least one rank in Corruption to gain Sorcery, and for each rank, you get to pick a magical discipline, or Sorcerous Sphere as it's called. In this game, there is no such thing as good sorcery. It's either all gotten from some ancient snakefolk writing, or from demonic or demigod possession. And using sorcery will either corrupt your body or the area around you. By the way, the book has a great GM section, but you'll also notice a ton of GM advice in boxes in all the other chapters. I think this is a sign that the authors playtested this game extensively and have a lot of wisdom to share about it. Allegiances are a kind of investigative ability that are ranked by organization. There are permanent allegiances called allies and enemies, as well as one-offs called favors and grudges. This is one of the places in the game where it plugs in pretty directly into its built-in setting of the city of Eversync, but if you want to use your own setting, it would be easy enough to replace all of these factions with your own. The allegiance system actually acts as a potentially big element in a scene and an adventure in general because you can spend points to not merely influence members of a faction. If you throw enough points at an allegiance spend, you can manipulate the faction and even assume a leadership role in it. So abilities work the same way as the investigative ones, where you have a rank in them, and that determines how many replenishable points you can spend to strengthen them when the ability is deployed in a scene. One difference, though, is that your rank in a general ability can go all the way up to 15. And if you have a rank of 8 or higher in one, you gain a talent, which is like an extra bonus effect whenever you use the ability. You have a standard 30 points to allocate on general abilities and another 18 to put into health and morale. Health and morale are your two hit point pools that account for your physical and mental health. The list of general abilities is far shorter than the one for investigative ones, and if you'll notice, they're mostly oriented towards combat and confrontation. Anyway, you have to roll when using a general ability, which means they do have a chance of failure. Notice here in the athletics ability how the examples are listed in bulleted form. This is what I was talking about earlier. This formatting is much easier to read and scan at a glance. It should be noted that Sorcery, the ability that you unlock by having at least one rank in Corruption, is a straight up combat ability. You can describe the spells however you want, but you have to decide early on if they do health or morale damage. Mechanically, the rules are only trying to define how many people you can hit with a cast and how much damage you can levy. There are about 15 archetypes that you can start with here, which can be helpful, but it's worth noting that in practice, you don't have to spend all your build points at the start of the game. You can wait until you need them for a certain ability in a scene, then decide that your character has ranks in that ability as needed. So committing to one of these archetypes might restrict you a bit. I think the most important paragraph in this book for people who might have doubts about this game using the gumshoe system is on this page. As mentioned, there are clues embedded in every scene, and you use specific investigative and sometimes general abilities to uncover those clues in order to unlock the next scene. But here's the thing, quote, "Not every adventure is a mystery. In a straightforward action story or a heist, your investigative abilities give you leads into danger, excitement, and rewards." It's the terminology that gets in the way here. Using the terms lead, clue, and investigation gives you the impression that this game is far more straitjacketed than it really is. Even the label gumshoe, I think, has turned off a lot of people on this game because the impression is that it's sword and sorcery shoehorned into some corny Scooby-Doo mystery framework, when in actuality, it's a full-on adventure game optimized for not just plot unraveling of any sort, but combat, dangerous magic, and at all times a constant forward motion. Okay, so anytime you want to use a general ability, you have to roll. A simple test involves the GM setting a difficulty number, anywhere from 3 to 12, but usually 4, and then you roll a single d6. If you meet or exceed the difficulty, you pass the test. Obviously, you can add bonuses to your roll, first and foremost from the relevant general ability pool if you have any points there. Combat is designed in a pretty traditional manner for the most part. First, you determine range. There are 5 ranges in the game. Then determine initiative. This is a little unusual. The GM picks the first person to take their turn in a round, and then that person picks the next character, either a party member or an enemy, and then that person picks the next, and so on. Then when every character in an encounter has had their turn, the last person picks the first character for the new round. As far as actually attacking, you announce a target and then describe your attack. There are only 3 abilities used with attacks in this game: Warfare for health damage, Sway for morale damage, and Sorcery for either kind of damage. Again, with Sorcery, the actual description of the spell is completely up to the player, rooted in a sorceress sphere they possess. Then you spend general ability points if you want, and finally, roll the d6 against the target's health or morale threshold. Notice again here the use of advice boxes, in this case advice for players. I think by the end of this book I was dying to play this game so badly because these boxes were really very inviting. Anyway, weapon attacks damage a foe's health, and incoming damage is reduced by the target's armor rating. You can increase damage in a number of ways, including spending general and investigative ability points, and through the size of your weapon generally. If your damage exceeds the target's threshold by 5 or more, then that's a critical hit and you inflict an extra d6 of damage. Maneuvers are pretty interesting. They're like a sort of ultimatum for the target. You specify an effect that your target has to face, and they either accept it or try to roll against it. You first have to roll a successful Warfare, Sway, or Sorcery ability check, and depending on how high your modified roll was, that is the target your opponent has to beat on their roll. Here are some more examples of maneuvers on the left. It's a pretty clever rule for NPC engagement. There's a really good few pages on traps, including a bulleted discussion of traps by intention, then how every single ability in the game relates to traps, then a guide on how to make your own traps with a couple of examples of a trap stat block. And importantly over here is the bit on how ability points are refreshed. There are just a few important points to make about sorcery in this game. The first is that you as a player characterize the specifics of any given spell using one of these spheres, or what might be described as schools. Actually, spheres is the better term since there's no formal schooling of these magics. You either get it from dabbling in ancient evil texts written by the snake people from thousands of years ago, or you're just straight up possessed by a spirit or a god. You can also make up your own sphere if you don't see the one you want here. Spheres are really for flavor. The second thing about sorcery is that it can be explosively destructive, or really more specifically, corruption can. When you spend points from your corruption ability, which is that core underlying ability that enables sorcery in the first place, you can increase damage in spectacular ways. This text box sort of explains just how dangerous corruption spends can be. Spending corruption points will always force you to choose between corrupting yourself or corrupting the environment. If you choose internal corruption, depending on how well you roll, you will either take on a hard to notice mutation, like all your toenails falling off, or a major change that is noticed by observers, like your pupils changing to look like a snake's, or your feet becoming hooved. Externalizing corruption involves terrorizing members of your party who fail a morale test, as well as degrading your surrounding environment in stages and for periods lasting from a month to as long as all of eternity. The table here on the right illustrates just how severe it can get, but the real fallout here is that you'll anger the various factions of the city when you externalize corruption. No one wants that mess in their backyard. The adversaries chapter really drives home just how combat oriented this game is. If you look at the template for a stat block here, you'll see that there's not much else being considered. Although to be fair, morale and sway have to do with psychological combat, if you want to call it that. Entire encounters in this game can take place in the form of heated conversation over a banquet table. There's this concept called malice, which is a point pool that can be used to nudge an NPC's abilities up in one way or another. You can see the malice costs on this table here to get an idea of how that works. As far as the provided stat blocks for NPCs, it's pretty much all the ones you would ever need. By the way, I didn't mention it before, but the default setting for this game is mostly humans. There are monsters, ghosts, snake folk, and other things, but they aren't openly living in society the way you would see elves and dwarves hanging out in Waterdeep. The monstrosities, as they're called, are meant to be used sparingly, as an end cap to a session or adventure. And in a best case scenario, they are intelligent and scheming, or at least connected to a human who is using them intelligently. That is opposed to throwing monsters at players just for them to slaughter. You'll see a lot borrowed from European folklore as well as classic sword and sorcery literature here. As the story goes, Kevin Kolb wrote the rules part of this game and Emily Dressner wrote the setting components. The setting of the city of Eversync is actually one of the centerpieces of this game, although you don't need to set your game in it at all. It's like an optional centerpiece. Due to wanting to keep the length of this video under control, I'm only going to lightly gloss over this section. If there's enough interest in the comments for a separate video on Eversync, I'll happily do one. There's enough material in this book about the city and the world at large that it really could fill a whole video. So here's the deal with the city. It started out several thousand years ago as a small settlement called Denaria, nestled in the delta of the river Serpentine. The city's patron goddess, Denari, helped to push back the swamp and raised islands from under the water to buoy the city. In this world, all the gods are small. Denari herself started off as a minor swan god in the swamps. The people's belief in her elevated her powers and allowed her to raise the land for the city. But over time, she changed through the beliefs of her worshippers into a goddess of unfettered mercantilism and commerce. Anyway, fast forward 1,000 years or whatever from the beginning of the settlement of Denaria to now, and you have 100,000 people living in a sprawling medieval fantasy megalopolis renamed Eversync because all the buildings are constantly and slowly sinking. It's a city known across the continent and wields unmatched economic clout among the civilizations. The actual details of the city go on for about 90 pages, and you're going to get a fully realized urban fantasy setting here. It resonates like a real city, based not only on fantasy cities like Lankhmar from Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, Camor from Lies of Loch Lamora, and Ankh-Morpork from Discworld, but obviously Venice of the real world, and wisps of 17th century Amsterdam, and aspects of New York and Chicago. One of the most remarkable aspects of this chapter is the number of plot hooks that are jammed in under each section of the city. It's just an inexhaustible idea factory tailored to the game, and there's no way a GM could realize all of them. One of the major plot elements you could probably use in any adventure is the city's government, which is a secretive cabal known as the Triskelion. An anonymous oligarchy, as it's described, this cabal is made up of 13 randomly chosen citizens who govern through decrees issued through the city's church, various spy services, and a sprawling bureaucracy. But again, I'm going to cut myself short here on getting into the weeds of Eversync as much as I want to, because it's a thing all its own. It's also worth noting that there is another shorter chapter that describes the rest of the world, but in much briefer terms. There are about 10 kingdoms or major civilizations at large, and they are described in broad, almost cliched terms, and that's intentional. The idea here is that you can pick up one of these regions as a GM and customize it however you want. It's almost like a sandbox fantasy world with some light suggestions on where to start. What's interesting is that it's still a coherent, consistent world and all still fits neatly within the sword and sorcery genre. I think it would be quite a treat to see Emily Dressner put as much detail into some of these regions one day as she did into the city of Eversync itself. Alright, here are my thoughts on Swords of the Serpentine. PDF is large, and what I mean by large is that it's 357 megabytes. It's a 360-page document, which is a lot of pages, but I think they could have optimized the PDF a little bit. If you do buy this game and you're having problems with the file size, Adobe has a free online PDF resizer that you can use to create a smaller, more portable version of the file. Written a bit wordy. I found that the writing was clear and enjoyable to read, but not concise in a lot of places. There were a good number of places with bulleted items and tables, which helped a lot, but also a number of places where important little rules were buried in almost conversational text. This makes it hard for GMs to quickly flip through and reference the rule that they might vaguely remember in the middle of play. Great cheat sheets and index. So on the one hand, you have a lot of little rules buried in paragraphs here and there, but on the other hand, the book has a really nice spread of rules summaries at the end, as well as a fully comprehensive index to find any rules you're trying to track down. There are also a lot of handy page references within the book itself, so they really ended up doing a fairly good job on user friendliness. Achieves the theme. I think it's easy to pair a rule set with a genre and write an RPG. Any rule set with any genre can be written. The hard part comes in refining the rules and playtesting that game to the point where you understand why you have kept all the rules that you've kept and can explain how to run the game so that players experience the theme you were going for in the first place. This game is trying to put players in the shoes of heroes who exist in a fairly specific subgenre of fantasy fiction, sword and sorcery. And there are a lot of reasons why it works. The danger of using magic, the emphasis on social standing and social relations, the primarily urban environment that limits the scope of the adventure, at least by default, and the gumshoe framework of linking characters to a narrative progression track that resembles an investigation. But it doesn't have to be an investigation like some episode of Law & Order. Investigation and clues are loose terms here. What PCs are doing is going on adventures, and they are guided along by plot strings that connect one scene to the next, really almost like any RPG. Player fun comes first. The book is littered with really great boxed text that advise players and GMs on how to play and how to keep the game fun. And this is all besides the GM section itself. This overlord directive of trying to engineer the most fun for the players is one I appreciate a lot. The authors didn't just say, hey, this is your game now, you can do what you want. They actually provide a number of alternate rules and discuss gameplay impacts and the reasoning for those rules. Eversync. The description of the city of Eversync, as well as the bonus chapter that provides generic but distinct neighboring realms of the continent, are more than just a rotely written bazaar of locations. The chapter on the city in particular gives you a really clear picture of a sprawling fantasy city full of danger and doom, not just in the location descriptions, but in the page-by-page plot hooks. There are almost as many plot hooks here as there are paragraphs of description, which is a very pro-user design choice by the authors. Plug-and-play setting. There are a few places here and there in the rules where Eversync is mentioned, its culture of magic and other things, but for the most part you can plug this game into any fantasy setting you'd like, as long as magic is relatively rare and dangerous. Support materials. There's not only a great page on the Pelgrane website that collects all of the official free resources for the game, but also a fan-made and officially sanctioned web app that will quickly create a character, adversary, city government, or name of any person or place that you need on the fly. There have been so many sword and sorcery RPGs published at this point, but the questions you have to ask are, what did the designers value most when making the game, and how much time did they spend playtesting and thinking about their game before publishing it? You really get the feeling with Swords of the Serpentine that the thing that they most valued was a fluid genre simulation that maxes out on entertainment and minimizes the boring bits. And it's pretty clear that the rules were polished to a shine. In a perfect world, every RPG would be like this, but honestly, these don't get published all too often. Let me know your experience with Gumshoe and with Swords of the Serpentine. And if you'd like to keep this channel going, please consider joining my Patreon. All the links for everything are down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.